Kapital by Karl Marx, Volume 1, Editor's Preface to the English edition, 1886. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Kapital by Karl Marx, Volume 1, Editor's Preface to the English edition, 1886. The publication of an English version of Das Kapital needs no apology. On the contrary, an explanation might be expected why this English version has been delayed until now, seeing that for some years past, the theories advocated in this book have been constantly referred to, attacked and defended, interpreted and misinterpreted in the periodical press and the current literature of both England and America. When, soon after the author's death in 1883, it became evident that an English edition of the work was really required, Mr. Samuel Moore, for many years a friend of Marx and of the present writer, and than whom perhaps no one is more conversant with the book itself, consented to undertake the translation which the literary executors of Marx were anxious to lay before the public. It was understood that I should compare the manuscript with the original work and suggest such alterations as I might deem advisable. When, by and by, it was found that Mr. Moore's professional occupations prevented him from finishing the translation as quickly as we all desired, we gladly accepted Dr. Aveling's offer to undertake a portion of the work. At the same time, Mrs. Aveling, Marx's youngest daughter, offered to check the quotations and to restore the original text of the numerous passages taken from English authors and blue books and translated by Marx into German. This has been done throughout, with but a few unavoidable exceptions. The following portions of the book have been translated by Dr. Aveling. 1. Chapters 10, The Working Day, and 11, Rate and Mass of Surplus Value. 2. Part 6, Wages, comprising chapters 19 to 22. 3. From chapter 24, section 4, Circumstance that, etc., to the end of the book, comprising the latter part of chapter 24, chapter 25, and the whole of part 8. Chapters 26 to 33. 4. The two authors' prefaces. All the rest of the book has been done by Mr. Moore. While thus each of the translators is responsible for his share of the work only, I bear a joint responsibility for the whole. The third German edition, which has been made the basis of our work throughout, was prepared by me in 1883, with the assistance of notes left by the author, indicating the passages of the second edition to be replaced by designated passages from the French text published in 1873. Footnote. Le Capital,
par Karl Marx. Traduction de M.J. Roy, entièrement revisée par l'auteur. Paris, La Châtre.
This translation, especially the latter part of the book, contains considerable alterations in and additions to the text of the second German edition. End footnote. The alterations thus effected in the text of the second edition generally coincided with the changes prescribed by Marx in a set of manuscript instructions for an English translation that was planned about 10 years ago in America, but abandoned chiefly for want of a fit and proper translator. This manuscript was placed at our disposal by our old friend Mr. F.A. Sorge of Hoboken, New Jersey. It designates some further interpolations from the French edition, but being so many years older than the final instructions for the third edition, I did not consider myself at liberty to make use of it otherwise than sparingly, and chiefly in cases where it helped us over difficulties. In the same way, the French text has been referred to in most of the difficult passages as an indicator of what the author himself was prepared to sacrifice, wherever something of the full import of the original had to be sacrificed in the rendering. There is, however, one difficulty we could not spare the reader: the use of certain terms in a sense different from what they have, not only in common life, but in ordinary political economy. But this was unavoidable. Every new aspect of a science involves a revolution in the technical terms of that science. This is best shown by chemistry, where the whole of the terminology is radically changed about once in 20 years, and where you will hardly find a single organic compound that has not gone through a series of different names. Political economy has generally been content to take, just as they were, the terms of commercial and industrial life, and to operate with them, entirely failing to see that by so doing it confined itself within the narrow circles of ideas expressed by those terms. Thus, though perfectly aware that both profits and rent are but subdivisions, fragments of that unpaid part of the product which the labourer has to supply to his employer, its first appropriator, though not its ultimate exclusive owner, yet even classic political economy never went beyond the received notions of profits and rents, never examined this unpaid part of the product, called by Marx surplus product, in its integrity as a whole, and therefore never arrived at a clear comprehension either of its origin and nature, or of the laws that regulate the subsequent distribution of its value. Similarly, all industry, not agricultural or handicraft, is indiscriminately comprised in the term of manufacture, and thereby the distinction is obliterated between two great and essentially different periods of economic history, the period of manufacture proper, based on the division of manual labour, and the period of modern industry based on machinery. It is, however, self-evident that a theory which views modern capitalist production as a mere passing stage in the economic history of mankind must make use of terms different from those habitual to writers who look upon that form of production as imperishable and final. A word respecting the author's method of quoting may not be out of place. In the majority of cases, the quotations serve, in the usual way, as documentary evidence in support of assertions made in the text. But in many instances, passages from economic writers are quoted in order to indicate when, where, and by whom a certain proposition was for the first time clearly enunciated. This is done in cases where the proposition quoted is of importance as being a more or less adequate expression of the conditions of social production and exchange prevalent at the time, and quite irrespective of Marx's recognition or otherwise of its general validity. These quotations, therefore, supplement the text by a running commentary taken from the history of the science. Our translation comprises the first book of the work only, but this first book is in a great measure a whole in itself, and has for 20 years ranked as an independent work. The second book, edited in German by me in 1885, is decidedly incomplete without the third, which cannot be published before the end of 1887. When Book 3 has been brought out in the original German, it will then be soon enough to think about preparing an English edition of both. Das Kapital is often called on the continent the Bible of the working class. That the conclusions arrived at in this work are daily more and more becoming the fundamental principles of the great working class movement, not only in Germany and Switzerland, but in France, in Holland and Belgium, in America, and even in Italy and Spain, that everywhere the working class more and more recognizes in these conclusions the most adequate expression of its condition and of its aspirations, nobody acquainted with that movement will deny. And in England too, the theories of Marx, even at this moment, exercise a powerful influence upon the socialist movement, which is spreading in the ranks of cultured people no less than in those of the working class. But that is not all. The time is rapidly approaching when a thorough examination of England's economic position will impose itself as an irresistible national necessity. The working of the industrial system of this country, impossible without a constant and rapid extension of production, and therefore of markets, is coming to a dead stop. Free trade has exhausted its resources. Even Manchester doubts this, its quondam economic gospel. Footnote. At the quarterly meeting of the Manchester Chamber of Commerce, held this afternoon, a warm discussion took place on the subject of free trade. A resolution was moved to the effect that, quote, having waited in vain 40 years for other nations to follow the free trade example of England, this chamber thinks the time has now arrived to reconsider that position. End quote. The resolution was rejected by a majority of only one, the figures being 21 for and 22 against. Evening Standard, November the 1st, 1886. End footnote. Foreign industry, rapidly developing, stares English production in the face everywhere, not only in protected, but also in neutral markets, and even on this side of the Channel. While the productive power increases in a geometric, the extension of markets proceeds at best in an arithmetic ratio. The decennial cycle of stagnation, prosperity, overproduction and crisis, ever recurrent from 1825 to 1867, seems indeed to have run its course, but only to land us in the slough of despond of a permanent and chronic depression. The sighed-for period of prosperity will not come. As often as we seem to perceive its heralding symptoms, so often do they again vanish into air. Meanwhile, each succeeding winter brings up afresh the great question, what to do with the unemployed. But while the number of the unemployed keeps swelling from year to year, there is nobody to answer that question, and we can almost calculate the moment when the unemployed, losing patience, will take their own fate into their own hands. Surely, at such a moment, the voice ought to be heard of a man whose whole theory is the result of a lifelong study of the economic history and condition of England, and whom that study led to the conclusion that, at least in Europe, England is the only country where the inevitable social revolution might be effected entirely by peaceful and legal means. He certainly never forgot to add that he hardly expected the English ruling classes to submit, without a pro-slavery rebellion, to this peaceful and legal revolution. Frederick Engels, November the 5th, 1886. End of Editor's Preface. Read by Karl Manchester, 2007. Kapital, Volume 1 by Karl Marx. Preface to the first German edition. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Karl Manchester, 2007. Kapital, Volume 1 by Karl Marx. Preface to the first German edition, 1867. The work, the first volume of which I now submit to the public, forms the continuation of my Zur Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, a contribution to the criticism of political economy, published in 1859. The long pause between the first part and the continuation is due to an illness of many years' duration that again and again interrupted my work. The substance of that earlier work is summarized in the first 3 chapters of this volume. This is not done merely for the sake of connection and completeness. The presentation of the subject matter is improved. As far as circumstances in any way permit, many points only hinted at in the earlier book are here worked out more fully, whilst, conversely, points worked out fully there are only touched upon in this volume. The sections on the history of the theories of value and of money are now, of course, left out altogether. The reader of the earlier work will find, however, in the notes to the first chapter, additional sources of reference relative to the history of those theories. Every beginning is difficult, holds in all sciences. To understand the first chapter, especially the section that contains the analysis of commodities, will therefore present the greatest difficulty. That which concerns more especially the analysis of the substance of value and the magnitude of value I have, as much as it was possible, popularized. Footnote. This is the more necessary, as even the section of Ferdinand Lassalle's work against Schulze de Leech, in which he professes to give the intellectual quintessence of my explanations on these subjects, contains important mistakes. If Ferdinand Lassalle has borrowed almost literally from my writings, and without any acknowledgement, all the general theoretical propositions in his economic works, e.g. those on the historical character of capital, on the connection between the conditions of production and the mode of production, etc., etc., even to the terminology created by me, this may perhaps be due to purposes of propaganda. I am here, of course, not speaking of his detailed working out and application of these propositions, with which I have nothing to do. End footnote. The value form, whose fully developed shape is the money form, is very elementary and simple. Nonetheless, the human mind has for more than 2,000 years sought in vain to get to the bottom of it all, whilst, on the other hand, to the successful analysis of much more composite and complex forms there has been at least an approximation. Why? Because the body, as an organic whole, is more easy of study than are the cells of the body. In the analysis of economic forms, moreover, neither microscopes nor chemical reagents are of use. The force of abstraction must replace both. But in bourgeois society, the commodity form of the product of labour, or value form of the commodity, is the economic cell form. To the superficial observer, the analysis of these forms seems to turn upon minutiae. It does in fact deal with minutiae, but they are of the same order as those dealt with in microscopic anatomy. With the exception of the section of value form, therefore, this volume cannot stand accused on the score of difficulty. I presuppose, of course, a reader who is willing to learn something new and therefore to think for himself. The physicist either observes physical phenomena where they occur in their most typical form and most free from disturbing influence, or, wherever possible, he makes experiments under conditions that assure the occurrence of the phenomena in its normality. In this work, I have to examine the capitalist mode of production and the conditions of production and exchange corresponding to that mode. Up to the present time, their classic ground is England. That is the reason why England is used as the chief illustration in the development of my theoretical ideas. If, however, the German reader shrugs his shoulders at the condition of the English industrial and agricultural labourers, or, in optimist fashion, comforts himself with the thought that in Germany things are not nearly so bad, I must plainly tell him, de te fabula narrateur. It is of you that the story is told. Horace. Intrinsically, it is not a question of the higher or lower degree of development of the social antagonisms that result from the natural laws of capitalist production. It is a question of these laws themselves, of these tendencies working with iron necessity towards inevitable results. The country that is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future. But apart from this, where capitalist production is fully naturalized among the Germans, for instance in the factories proper, the condition of things is much worse than in England, because the counterpoise of the Factory Acts is wanting. In all other spheres, we, like the rest of continental Western Europe, suffer not only from the development of capitalist production, but also from the incompleteness of that development. Alongside the modern evils, a whole series of inherited evils oppress us, arising from the passive survival of antiquated modes of production, with their inevitable train of social and political anachronisms. We suffer not only from the living, but from the dead. Le mort saisit le vif. The dead holds the living in his grasp. Formula of French common law. The social statistics of Germany and the rest of continental Western Europe are, in comparison with those of England, wretchedly compiled. But they raise the veil just enough to let us catch a glimpse of the Medusa head behind it. We should be appalled at the state of things at home if, as in England, our governments and parliaments appointed periodically commissions of inquiry into economic conditions, if these commissions were armed with the same plenary powers to get at the truth, if it were possible to find for this purpose men as competent, as free from partisanship and respect of persons, as are the English factory inspectors, her medical reporters on public health, her commissioners of inquiry into the exploitation of women and children, into housing and food. Perseus wore a magic cap down over his eyes and ears as a make-believe that there are no monsters. Let us not deceive ourselves on this. As in the 18th century the American War of Independence sounded the tocsin for the European middle class, so that in the 19th century the American Civil War sounded it for the European working class. In England, the process of social disintegration is palpable. When it has reached a certain point, it must react on the continent. There it will take a form more brutal or more humane according to the degree of development of the working class itself. Apart from higher motives, therefore, their own most important interests dictate to the classes that are for the nonce the ruling ones the removal of all legally removable hindrances to the free development of the working class. For this reason, as well as others, I have given so large a space in this volume to the history, the details, and the results of English factory legislation. One nation can and should learn from others, and even when a society has got upon the right track for the discovery of the natural laws of its movement, and it is the ultimate aim of this work to lay bare the economic law of motion of modern society, it can neither clear by bold leaps, nor remove by legal enactments, the obstacles offered by the successive phases of its normal development. But it can shorten and lessen the birth pangs. To prevent possible misunderstandings, a word. I paint the capitalist and the landlord in no sense couleur de rose, i.e. seen through rose-tinted glasses, but here individuals are dealt with, only insofar as they are the personifications of economic categories, embodiments of particular class relations and class interests. My standpoint, from which the evolution of the economic formation of society is viewed as a process of natural history, can, less than any other, make the individual responsible for relations whose creature he socially remains, however much he may subjectively raise himself above them. In the domain of political economy, free scientific inquiry meets not merely the same enemies as in all other domains. The peculiar nature of the materials it deals with summons as foes into the field of battle the most violent, mean, and malignant passions of the human breast, the furies of private interest. The English established church, for example, will more readily pardon an attack on 38 of its 39 articles than on 1/39 of its income. Nowadays, atheism is culpa levis, a relatively slight sin, contrast with mortal sin, as compared with criticism of existing property relations. Nevertheless, there is an unmistakable advance. I refer, for example, to the Blue Book published within the last few weeks, correspondence with Her Majesty's missions abroad regarding industrial questions and trades unions. The representatives of the English Crown in foreign countries there declare in so many words that in Germany, in France, to be brief, in all the civilized states of the European continent, radical change in the existing relations between capital and labour is as evident and inevitable as in England. At the same time, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, Mr. Wade, Vice President of the United States, declared in public meetings that, after the abolition of slavery, a radical change of the relations of capital and of property in land is next upon the order of the day. These are signs of the times, not to be hidden by purple mantles or black cassocks. They do not signify that tomorrow a miracle will happen. They show that, within the ruling classes themselves, a foreboding is dawning, that the present society is no solid crystal, but an organism capable of change, and is constantly changing. The second volume of this book will treat of the process of the circulation of capital, Book 2, and of the varied forms assumed by capital in the course of its development, Book 3. The third and last volume, Book 4, the history of the theory. Every opinion based on scientific criticism I welcome. As to prejudices of so-called public opinion, to which I have never made concessions, now as aforetime, the maxim of the great Florentine is mine. Segui il tuo corso e lasciatir le genti. Follow your own course and let people talk. Paraphrased from Dante. Karl Marx, London, July the 25th, 1867. End of the preface to the first German edition. Read by Karl Manchester, 2007.
Kapital by Karl Marx. Afterward to the second edition, 1873. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Karl Manchester, 2007. Kapital by Karl Marx. Afterward to the second edition, 1873. To the present moment, political economy in Germany is a foreign science. Gustav von Gulick, in his historical description of commerce, industry, etc., especially in the two first volumes published in 1830, has examined at length the historical circumstances that prevented, in Germany, the development of the capitalist mode of production, and consequently the development in that country of modern bourgeois society. Thus the soil whence political economy springs was wanting. This science had to be imported from England and France as a ready-made article. Its German professors remained schoolboys. The theoretical expression of a foreign reality was turned in their hands into a collection of dogmas, interpreted by them in terms of the petty trading world around them, and therefore misinterpreted. The feeling of scientific impotence, a feeling not wholly to be repressed, and the uneasy consciousness of having to touch on a subject in reality foreign to them, was but imperfectly concealed. either under a parade of literary and historical erudition, or by an admixture of extraneous material, borrowed from the so-called chimeral sciences, a medley of smatterings, through whose purgatory the hopeless candidate for the German bureaucracy has to pass. Since 1848, capitalist production has developed rapidly in Germany, and at the present time it is in the full bloom of speculation and swindling. But fate is still unpropitious to our professional economists. At the time when they were able to deal with political economy in a straightforward fashion, modern economic conditions did not actually exist in Germany. And as soon as these conditions did come into existence, they did so under circumstances that no longer allowed of their being really and impartially investigated within the bounds of the bourgeois horizon insofar, i.e., as the capitalist regime is looked upon as the absolutely final form of social production, instead of as a passing historical phase of its evolution. Political economy can remain a science only so long as the class struggle is latent or manifests itself only in isolated and sporadic phenomena. Let us take England. Its political economy belongs to the period in which the class struggle was as yet undeveloped. Its last great representative, Ricardo, in the end, consciously makes the antagonism of class interests, of wages and profits and rent, the starting point of his investigations, naively taking this antagonism for a social law of nature. But by this start, the science of bourgeois economy had reached the limits beyond which it could not pass. Already in the lifetime of Ricardo, and in opposition to him, it was met by criticism, in the person of Sismondi. Footnote: see my work Zur Kritik, etc., page 39. End footnote. The succeeding period, from 1820 to 1830, was notable in England for scientific activity in the domain of political economy. It was the time, as well as the vulgarising and extending of Ricardo's theory, as to the contest of that theory with the old school. Splendid tournaments were held. What was done then is little known to the continent generally, because the polemic is for the most part scattered through articles in reviews, occasional literature and pamphlets. The unprejudiced character of this polemic, although the theory of Ricardo already serves, in exceptional cases, as a weapon of attack upon bourgeois economy, is explained by the circumstances of the time. On the one hand, modern industry itself was only just emerging from the age of childhood, as is shown by the fact that with the crisis of 1825 it for the first time opens the periodic cycle of its modern life. On the other hand, the class struggle between capital and labour is forced into the background, politically by the discord between the governments and the feudal aristocracy gathered around the Holy Alliance on the one hand, and the popular masses, led by the bourgeoisie, on the other. Economically, by the quarrel between industrial capital and aristocratic landed property, a quarrel that in France was concealed by the opposition between small and large landed property, and that in England broke out openly after the Corn Laws. The literature of political economy in England at this time calls to mind the stormy forward movement in France after Dr. Quesnay's death, but only as a St. Martin's summer reminds us of spring. With the year 1830 came the decisive crisis. In France and in England, the bourgeoisie had conquered political power. Thenceforth, the class struggle, practically as well as theoretically, took on more and more outspoken and threatening forms. I sounded the knell of scientific bourgeois economy. It was thenceforth no longer a question whether this theorem or that was true, but whether it was useful to capital or harmful, expedient or inexpedient, politically dangerous or not. In place of disinterested inquirers, there were hired prize fighters. In place of genuine scientific research, the bad conscience and the evil intent of apologetic. Still, even the obtrusive pamphlets with which the Anti-Corn Law League, led by the manufacturers Cobham and Bright, deluged the world, have a historic interest, if no scientific one, on account of their polemic against the landed aristocracy. But since then, the free trade legislation, inaugurated by Sir Robert Peel, has deprived vulgar economy of this its last sting. The Continental Revolution of 1848–9 also had its reaction in England. Men who still claimed some scientific standing and aspired to be something more than mere sophists and sycophants of the ruling classes tried to harmonise the political economy of capital with the claims, no longer to be ignored, of the proletariat, hence a shallow syncretism of which John Stuart Mill is the best representative. It is a declaration of bankruptcy by bourgeois economy, an event on which the great Russian scholar and critic N. Chernyshevsky has thrown the light of a master mind in his Outlines of Political Economy according to Mill. In Germany, therefore, the capitalist mode of production came to a head after its antagonistic character had already in France and England shown itself in a fierce strife of classes. And meanwhile, moreover, the German proletariat had attained a much more clear class consciousness than the German bourgeoisie. Thus, at the very moment when a bourgeois science of political economy seemed at last possible in Germany, it had in reality become impossible. Under these circumstances, its professors fell into two groups. The one set, prudent, practical business folk, flocked to the banner of Bastiat, the most superficial, and therefore the most adequate, representative of the apologetic of vulgar economy. The other, proud of the professional dignity of their science, followed John Stuart Mill in his attempt to reconcile irreconcilables. Just as in the classical time of bourgeois economy, so also in the time of its decline, the Germans remained mere schoolboys, imitators and followers, petty retailers and hawkers, in the service of the great foreign wholesale concern. The peculiar historic development of German society, therefore, forbids in that country all the original work in bourgeois economy, but not the criticism of that economy. So far as such criticism represents a class, it can only represent the class whose vocation in history is the overthrow of the capitalist mode of production and the final abolition of all classes, the proletariat. The learned and unlearned spokesmen of the German bourgeoisie tried at first to kill Das Kapital by silence, as they had managed to do with my earlier writings. As soon as they found that these tactics no longer fitted the conditions of the time, they wrote, under pretence of criticising my book, descriptions, quote, for the tranquilization of the bourgeois mind, end quote. But they found in the workers' press, see, for example, Joseph Dietzgen's articles in the Volksstaat, antagonists stronger than themselves to whom, down to this very day, they owe a reply. Footnote. The mealy-mouthed babblers of German vulgar economy fell foul of the style of my book. No one can feel the literary shortcomings in Das Kapital more strongly than I myself, yet I will, for the benefit and enjoyment of these gentlemen and their public, quote in this connection one English and one Russian notice. The Saturday Review, always hostile to my views, said in its notice of the first edition, quote, the presentation of the subject invests the driest economic questions with a certain peculiar charm, end quote. The St. Petersburg Journal, Sankt Petersburgsky Vedomosti, in its issue of April 20th, 1872, says, quote, the presentation of the subject, with the exception of one or two exceptionally special parts, is distinguished by its comprehensibility by the general reader, its clearness, and, in spite of the scientific intricacy of the subject, by an unusual liveliness. In this respect, the author in no way resembles the majority of German scholars who write their books in a language so dry and obscure that the heads of ordinary mortals are cracked by it. End quote. End footnote. An excellent Russian translation of Das Kapital appeared in the spring of 1872. The edition of 3,000 copies is already nearly exhausted. As early as 1871, A. Sierber, professor of political economy in the University of Kiev, in his work David Ricardo's Theory of Value and of Capital, referred to my theory of value, of money and of capital as in its fundamentals a necessary sequel to the teaching of Smith and Ricardo. That which astonishes the Western European in the reading of this excellent work is the author's consistent and firm grasp of the purely theoretical position. That the method employed in Das Kapital has been little understood is shown by the various conceptions, contradictory one to another, that have been formed of it. Thus the Paris Revue Positiviste reproaches me in that on the one hand I treat economics metaphysically, and on the other hand, confine myself to the mere critical analysis of actual facts, instead of writing receipts, contist ones, for the cookshops of the future. In answer to the reproach in re metaphysics, Professor Sierber has it, quote, "Insofar as it deals with actual theory, the method of Marx is the deductive method of the whole English school, a school whose failings and virtues are common to the best theoretical economists." End quote. Monsieur Bloch, le théoricien du socialisme en Allemagne, extrait du Journal des économistes, juillet et août 1872, makes the discovery that my method is analytic and says, quote, "Par cet ouvrage, Monsieur Marx se classe parmi les esprits analytiques les plus éminents." End quote. With this work, Mr. Marx puts himself among the most eminent of analytical minds. German reviews, of course, shriek out at Hegelian sophistics. The European Messenger of St. Petersburg, in an article dealing exclusively with the method of Das Kapital, May number 1872, pages 427 to 436, finds my method of inquiry severely realistic, but my method of presentation, unfortunately, German dialectical. It says, quote, "At first sight, if the judgment is based on the external form of the presentation of the subject, Marx is the most ideal of ideal philosophers, always in the German, i.e. the bad sense of the word. But in point of fact, he is infinitely more realistic than all his forerunners in the work of economic criticism. He can in no sense be called an idealist." End quote. I cannot answer the writer better than by aid of a few extracts from his own criticism, which may interest some of my readers, to whom the Russian original is inaccessible. After a quotation from the preface to my Criticism of Political Economy, Berlin 1859, pages 4 to 7, where I discuss the materialistic basis of my method, the writer goes on, quote, "The one thing which is of moment to Marx is to find the laws of the phenomena with whose investigation he is concerned, and not only is that law of moment to him which governs these phenomena in so far as they have a definite form and mutual connection within a given historical period, of still greater moment to him is the law of their variation, of their development, i.e. of their transition from one into another, from one series of connections into a different one. This law once discovered, he investigates in detail the effects in which it manifests itself in social life. Consequently, Marx only troubles himself about one thing, to show by rigid scientific investigation the necessity of successive determinate orders of social conditions, and to establish, as impartially as possible, the facts that serve him for fundamental starting points. For this is quite enough if he proves at the same time both the necessity of another order into which the first must inevitably pass over, and this all the same whether men believe or do not believe it, whether they are conscious or unconscious of it. Marx treats the social movement as a process of natural history, governed by laws not only independent of human will, consciousness, and intelligence, but rather, on the contrary, determining that will, consciousness, and intelligence. If in the history of civilization the conscious element plays a part so subordinate, then it is self-evident that a critical inquiry whose subject matter is civilization can, less than anything else, have for its basis any form of, or any result of, consciousness. That is to say, that not the idea but the material phenomena alone can serve as its starting point. Such an inquiry will confine itself to the confrontation and the comparison of a fact, not with ideas, but with another fact. For this inquiry, the one thing of moment is that both facts can be investigated as accurately as possible, and that they actually form, each with respect to the other, different momenta of an evolution. But most important of all is the rigid analysis of the series of successions, of the sequences and concatenations in which the different stages of such an evolution present themselves. But, it will be said, the general laws of economic life are one and the same, no matter whether they are applied to the present or the past. This Marx directly denies. According to him, such abstract laws do not exist. On the contrary, in his opinion, every historical period has laws of its own. As soon as society has outlived a given period of development and is passing over from one given stage to another, it begins to be subject also to other laws. In a word, economic life offers us a phenomenon analogous to the history of evolution on other branches of biology. The old economists misunderstood the nature of economic laws when they likened them to the laws of physics and chemistry. A more thorough analysis of phenomena shows that social organisms differ among themselves as fundamentally as plants or animals. Nay, one and the same phenomenon falls under quite different laws in consequence of the different structure of those organisms as a whole, of the variations of their individual organs, of the different conditions in which those organs function, etc. Marx, for example, denies that the law of population is the same at all times and in all places. He asserts, on the contrary, that every stage of development has its own law of population. With the varying degree of development of productive power, social conditions and the laws governing them vary too. Whilst Marx sets himself the task of following and explaining from this point of view the economic system established by the sway of capital, he is only formulating in a strictly scientific manner the aim that every accurate investigation into economic life must have. The scientific value of such an inquiry lies in the disclosing of the special laws that regulate the origin, existence, development, death of a given social organism, and its replacement by another and higher one. And it is this value that, in point of fact, Marx's book has." End quote. Whilst the writer pictures what he takes to be actually my method, in this striking and, as far as concerns my own application of it, generous way, what else is he picturing but the dialectic method? Of course, the method of presentation must differ in form from that of inquiry. The latter has to appropriate the material in detail, to analyse its different forms of development, to trace out their inner connection. Only after this work is done can the actual movement be adequately described. If this is done successfully, if the life of the subject matter is ideally reflected as in a mirror, then it may appear as if we had before us a mere a priori construction. My dialectical method is not only different from the Hegelian, but is its direct opposite. To Hegel, the life process of the human brain, i.e. the process of thinking which, under the name of the idea, he even transforms into an independent subject, is the demiurgus of the real world, and the real world is only the external phenomenal form of the idea. With me, on the contrary, the ideal is nothing else than the material world reflected by the human mind and translated into forms of thought. The mystifying side of Hegelian dialectic I criticised nearly 30 years ago, at a time when it was still the fashion. But just as I was working at the first volume of Das Kapital, it was the good pleasure of the peevish, arrogant, mediocre epigonoi, who now talk large in cultured Germany, to treat Hegel in the same way as the brave Moses Mendelssohn in Lessing's time treated Spinoza, i.e. as a dead dog. I therefore openly avowed myself the pupil of that mighty thinker, and even here and there, in the chapter on the theory of value, coquetted with the modes of expression peculiar to him. The mystification which dialectic suffers in Hegel's hands by no means prevents him from being the first to present its general form of working in a comprehensive and conscious manner. With him it is standing on its head. It must be turned right side up again, if you would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. In its mystified form, dialectic became the fashion in Germany, because it seemed to transfigure and to glorify the existing state of things. In its rational form, it is a scandal and abomination to bourgeoisdom and its doctrinaire professors, because it includes in its comprehension an affirmative recognition of the existing state of things, at the same time also the recognition of the negation of that state, of its inevitable breaking up, because it regards every historically developed social form as in fluid movement, and therefore takes into account its transient nature not less than its momentary existence, because it lets nothing impose upon it, and is in its essence critical and revolutionary. The contradictions inherent in the movement of capitalist society impress themselves upon the practical bourgeois most strikingly in the changes of the periodic cycle, through which modern industry runs, and whose crowning point is the universal crisis. That crisis is once again approaching, although as yet but in its preliminary stage, and by the universality of its theatre and the intensity of its action, it will drum dialectics even into the heads of the mushroom upstarts of the new Holy Prusso-Germanic Empire. Karl Marx, London, January 24th, 1873. End of Afterword.